and supporters of the Institute, all audience and all viewers in front of the screens. The St. John Paul II Institute of Culture was established to look at the challenges facing the modern world and the Church in light of the life and thought of St. John Paul II. The idea of thinking with John Paul II has been embodied in the JP2 Lectures series, which are monthly lectures of eminent interdisciplinary academics who will revisit the extraordinary contribution of John Paul II for our own day. Last time, at the third JP2 lecture, we had the honor of hosting Professor Mirosława Grabowska. In her lecture, Professor Grabowska examined the sociological theory of secularization and various theoretical approaches to the changes taking place in the religiosity of Western society today. In our series, planned for this entire academic year 2022-2023, we will host such renewed lectures as Sister Helen Alford, Father Raymond de Souza, Dariusz Karłowicz, Russell Reno, Father Thierry Dominique Ambrecht, and Father Franciszek Longchamp de Berrier. Now, I'm pleased to give the floor to Father Michał Paluch, who will share more about our today's special guest.
Good afternoon, dear friends. It's my honor to introduce to you Antoine Arjakovsky, French historian with a doctorate in history from School of Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences in Paris. He worked for the French Ministry for Foreign Affairs between 1989 and 2002 and was the director of the French University of Moscow, Collège Universitaire Français de Moscou, the deputy director of the French Institute of Ukraine, and the founder of the Institute of Ecumenical Studies of Lviv. So you know the bunch of experiences which is very difficult to find anywhere in the world. Today he is research director at the Collège de Bernardins in Paris, president of the Association of Christian Philosophers, administrator of the Semaine Sociale de France, and administrator of the Platform of European Memory and Conscience in Prague. Today's lecture, titled Religion and Politics from Totalitarianism to Democracy, the Case of Ukraine, will start from the examination of what is exemplary and prophetic in the encyclical of Pope John Paul II, Centesimus Annus, published on the 1st of May 1991. Subsequently, the reasons for Ukraine's success in establishing a democratic state will be explained, together with an analysis of Russia's choice to go back to the old ways of the empire and to establish a neo-fascist state, despite its supposed passing from a totalitarian regime to a democratic regime after the collapse of the USSR. The lecture will conclude by way of proposing, with the help of ecumenical metaphysics and the social doctrines of the Catholic and Orthodox Churches, the possible ways out of the war which today pits Russia against Ukraine and more generally against the democratic world. Professor Arjakovsky, thanks for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. So, dear fathers, sisters, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to be with you to speak about this important issue of democratization of Ukraine and also way of thinking peace. So I thank the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas here for its invitation. Merci beaucoup. The idea is to speak about theological and also political reflection, how Ukraine came from a post-Soviet system to a democratic system. As it was said, I will start with an analysis of the prophetic encyclical of John Paul II, Centesimus Annus, of the 1st of May 1991. I mean, before the end of the Soviet Union, which happened in December 91, the Pope was ready to propose his political view on the future of Europe and of the world, and how to favor the passage from totalitarianism, but also from relativism, to an authentic democratic system. Then, in the second step, I will show how Ukraine, which welcomed the Pope John Paul II in June 2001, and I was happy to be there in Kyiv and in Lviv, Ukraine managed to establish a democratic regime, although non-perfect, like in other democratic countries, while at the same time Russia, which refused any visit of the Pope in Russia, you remember that was a problem. There were many invitations coming from, proposals coming from the Vatican, but they were never accepted in Russia. Russia, on the contrary, withdrawn into a neo-totalitarian system. So, for me, my main thesis, and I will conclude with this, is that only ecumenical metaphysics makes it possible to found an authentically democratic order and to find possible ways of building peace, including today when we have already entered in this piecemeal world war, as the Pope Francis says, une guerre mondiale par morceaux. So let us therefore begin first by briefly recalling the three main contributions for me of this encyclical, Centesimus Annus. The first one, the Church has a social doctrine capable of meeting the challenge of the crisis of ideologies. The second, for me, is that this doctrine of the social doctrine of the Church rests on ecumenical metaphysics. And the third main point for me coming from this Centesimus Annus is that this ecumenical metaphysics has very practical, political, economical consequences. So let's start with the first one. The Church has a social doctrine able of meeting the challenge of the crisis of ideologies. The visionary character of this encyclical consists in the fact that it didn't allow itself to be fooled by the illusion of the end of history. You remember that in 1991, the main idea was to speak about the end of history, Fukuyama, which was completely stupid. But today, our president, the President Macron, is always speaking that we suddenly came back to the time of the tragic, to the time of history, which means that he believed in this myth of the end of history. Fukuyama had a very big influence because the elites were very influenced by this Hegelian vision of the history. That was the mood, the illusion of the end of history. Or the other illusion was the false conception of the conflict of civilization, the clash of civilization, Huntington, with the wrong idea to say that there is an Orthodox civilization, an Islamic civilization. That was also wrong, because today you can see that you cannot put in the same bag Greece and Russia. On the contrary, Greece is part of the European Union, which is fighting against Russia. So that was also a mythology. The originality of the Pope, John Paul II, was that he was able to show very early the limits of socialism and communism, while showing also the limits and the risks of liberalism. Its originality consisted in thinking of the Church as a divine human reality called to transfigure the political and social body, and not to detach itself from the affairs of the world. It was in keeping with the encyclical of Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum, Centesimus Annus, 100 years later after Rerum Novarum, that gave citizenship to the Church in the changing realities of public life. But the Polish Pope brought also his own eschatological touch. And I quote him in the Centesimus Annus: "The kingdom of God, present in the world without being of the world, illuminates the order of human society as the energies of grace penetrate and enliven this order. Thus are better perceived the requirements of society worthy of man, deviations are rectified, the courage to work for the good is reinforced. To this task of evangelical animation of human realities are called, along with all men of goodwill, Christians, and especially the laity." So from these quotes of John Paul II, you see the eschatological belief that the kingdom of God is accessible in this world. You cannot say anymore, this world has no interest. The real life will start after death. In this eschatological vision, the kingdom is also, we can participate in the kingdom of God already now, in history, which means that the Church has responsibility. This approach allowed him to denounce the error of socialism, which reduced the human being to a set of social relations. From the idea of the person stem without any freedom. He also denounced the error of liberalism, the ideology according to which private property is an absolute value. Against Jeffrey Sachs, the ultra-liberal Consensus of Washington. The Consensus of Washington, maybe you heard about that, was adopted in 1991. Also in Washington by the elites of the political and economic world, from Jeffrey Sachs, the Harvard School of Economics, to the International Monetary Fund, Michel Candesu, and all these people at that time. Against this ultra-liberal Consensus of Washington, John Paul II defended the essential complementary principles such as, of course, private property, but also the universal destination of the goods of the earth. Private property should be put together with the idea of the common good, which was the most important originality of the Christian approach to the social doctrine. Before John Paul II and this Catholic vision of economics, you had only liberalism on one side, socialism on the other side. Second thing, which for me is really important in this Centesimus annus encyclical. This Christian social doctrine rests on ecumenical metaphysics. The encyclical recommended to political decision makers in both East and West a metaphysical approach to political and economic life, which was not at all in the mood of time also, which was much more marked by the postmodern thinking of Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and others. For John Paul II considered that relativism and skepticism undermined political life in the West at least as much as voluntarism and modernism in the East. To avoid this ideological impasse of skepticism on one side, of voluntarism on the other side, it was necessary to rediscover the path of metaphysics. You know that metaphysics was completely destroyed in the West since Heidegger. Heidegger explained that metaphysics, it's ontotheology. It means that we imprisoned God or being, so we need to put a cross on metaphysics. On the contrary, John Paul II, of course in Fides et Ratio, but also in this encyclical, in the article 44 of Centesimus, wrote the following: if the transcendent truth is not recognized, the force of power triumphs, and everyone tends to use to the end the means at his disposal to make his interest or his opinions prevail, without consideration for the rights of others. So, man is respected only insofar as it is possible to use him for the ends of a selfish preponderance. It is necessary, therefore, to locate the root of modern totalitarianism in the negation of the transcendent dignity of the human person, visible image of the invisible God, and precisely for this reason, by its very nature, subject of rights that no one can violate, neither the individual, neither the group, nor the class, nor the nation, nor the state. This is really important. You have here a foundation of democracy and also the announcement of the coming back of totalitarianism. With metaphysics, you can defend the person, the democracy. Without metaphysics, it's only the strongest who wins. And what John Paul II adds, for me it's very important, this metaphysics had to be open, ecumenical, that is to say, for him, transconfessional, trans-religious, trans-convictional. And today the Pope Francis adds transdisciplinary. This is a new understanding of ecumenism. Ecumenism before was to understand the dialogue between confession. And that's all. But you keep your own identity without changing anything. For John Paul II, on the contrary, it should be trans-confessional, religious, and convictional. I quote again, in the document Sollicitudo Rei Socialis, I also launched an appeal to the Christian churches and to all the great religions of the world, inviting them to bear unanimous witness to the common convictions of the dignity of man created by God. I am convinced, in fact, that religions will have a preponderant role today and tomorrow in the preservation of peace and in the construction of a society worthy of man. On the other hand, all people of goodwill are asked to be willing to dialogue and collaborate, and this applies in particular to people and groups who have their own responsibility in the political, economic, and social fields, whether nationally or internationally, end of quote. In this quote, you have everything. You have the metaphysics, and you have this new vision of ecumenism through trans-religious, and also trans-convictional dialogue, because he speaks about people of goodwill. In 1991, the Pope gave the golden rule for finding together, ecumenically, a third way between socialism and liberalism. For him, personalism makes it possible to go beyond the Hegelian vision of the all-powerful state and incarnation of the Spirit. This vision considers the person as a subject of rights capable of fulfilling itself with and for others in the name of the common good. This is the definition of personalism. The person as a subject of rights capable of fulfilling itself with and for others in the name of the common good. This is the key which allows to think together and to go beyond socialism and liberalism. And John Paul II gives also the method to follow. Freedom of choice must be at the service of truth and therefore of justice. For there is a constitutive link between human freedom and the truth, a link so strong that a freedom which refuses to bind itself to the truth would fall into arbitrariness and would end up submitting itself to the most degrading passions and self-destructions. He is announcing here our time of post-truth world. We are in a post-truth world. We are in a Nietzschean vision of truth which says there is no truth, there is only interpretations. John Paul II says this is wrong because you will never have any justice, any peace, if you don't believe anymore in the possibility of truth. So freedom should be at the service of truth. And the third point of this encyclical, which has concrete consequences that are important for us today, and this is why we should reread it, is that it has political, economical, and ecclesiological consequences. On the political level, according to John Paul II, it is good to conceive the rule of law as a system of balance between powers. I quote, "It is better than any power be balanced by other powers and by other skills, which keep it within fair limits. This is the principle of the rule of law, in which sovereignty belongs to the law and not to the arbitrary will of men." The Pope adds that the Church must play a very important role in this context, both as a watchdog and a ferment of democracy. I quote, "The Church cannot endorse the formation of small ruling groups that usurp the power of the state for the benefit of their particular interest or for ideological ends. Authentic democracy is only possible in a rule of law and on the basis of a correct conception of human person. It requires the realization of the necessary condition for the advancements of people through education and training in a true ideal, and also the development of the personality of society through the creation of structures of participation and co-responsibility." So that's the role of the Church, which is divided from the state, but should cooperate with the state. How? By proposing a new model of participation and co-responsibility. So the consequence on the economic level is the following, and I quote again, "It is necessary to endeavor a style of life in which the elements which determine the choice of consumption, savings, and investments are the search for true, beautiful, and good, as well as communion with other people for common growth." That has also lots of consequences. I will not detail now, but one of the main questions of the last presidential election in France was the question of a minimal subsistence income. Should we give or not a minimal subsistence income? John Paul II in 91 says yes. And the Pope Francis today is also saying yes. Well, that's very revolutionary, I would say. But this is a direct consequence of his economic vision. So, I wanted to remind very briefly the main ideas of this encyclical Centesimus Annus in order to understand why it is important for us to understand how democratization succeeded in Ukraine on the basis of this vision, and why in Russia, on the contrary, it failed because they had no understanding of this metaphysic, ecumenical metaphysics. So, I don't think that it is necessary to demonstrate either the democratic character of the Ukrainian government today or the neo-fascist state in Russia. Timothy Snyder spoke quite convincingly about that. I will not come back to this. Everyone knows the three great moments of Ukrainian national consciousness since 1991, namely, first of all, the Granite Maidan, which prompted the Ukrainian political elites to refuse the attempted neo-Soviet putsch in Moscow in August 91, and to proclaim as early of August 91 the independence of Ukraine, which was confirmed by referendum on December 1st and precipitated the end of USSR in December 91. Maidan de Granit, 91. We want to be independent. We don't want any more Soviet Union. Then took place the Maidan of the Orange Revolution, which defended the rule of law and therefore the rights of citizens to have free and unrigged elections, as had been the case during the second round of presidential elections in October 2004, and led again under pressure from civil society in a second round, and Viktor Yushchenko's victory. I remember I was in Lviv at that time at the Ukrainian Catholic University, and the students decided to demonstrate, to go to the demonstrations because they heard Cardinal Rousard saying, "You are all created at the image of God, you have an infinite dignity, so you have rights, and you should defend your rights." And this is why thousands and millions of people decided to fight, and finally, democracy won. Then, in 2013-2014, took place the third democratic Maidan, defending this time, in spite of the pressures of Putin and Yanukovych, the right of the Ukrainians to tend towards European civilization by the signing of a treaty of association between Ukraine and the EU. In all three cases, civil society was able to play a decisive role, exactly what the Pope said about the importance of laity in defending truth. Men and women have even died in the name of these ideals and values of independence, law, and justice. The churches, in particular the Catholic and Protestant churches, but also the Orthodox Church, defining themselves as Ukrainian, which are far by the majority in Ukraine, have played a decisive role each time in encouraging these developments and solidifying a national consciousness capable of overcoming confessional, linguistic, and cultural barriers. On the other side, in Russia, we have witnessed the gradual refusal by the elites who came to power in 1991 at the same time as the new president of the Russian Federation, Boris Yeltsin, to judge the communist past. That was the main failure of the beginning of the 90s in Russia. They refused, as Bukovsky proposed, the dissident, to organize a judgment on the communist crimes, and that was refused by Yeltsin and the elites. They refused to pass lustration laws against the Soviet elites. This is completely on the other side of what John Paul II spoke about, the necessity of justice and truth. They decided to go into amnesia. And the Orthodox Church of Moscow has not only refused to ask for forgiveness for its own compromises with the communist regime, but has also rehabilitated what I call a monophysite theology, inherited from the Soviet and imperialist past, and has propagated a new imperialist theory called the Russian world, Ruski Mir, which says that everywhere where you have a Russian speaker, you have Russia, which would be very dangerous in the West, especially in Belgium or in Swiss, for the French language. But the ecclesial factor is not the only key to explanation. During the meetings that I organized in 2018 and 2019 in Paris, but also in Kiev, in other cities in Europe, I gathered more than 200 experts. And I have done this, and I published in this document that you have maybe received, that was done with the Ukrainian Catholic University, but also with the Mogila Academy, and in Russia with Memorial, the Human Rights Society, when it was not closed yet. So we understood that peace discussions in the Normandy format are not working. Merkel, Macron, Zelensky, Putin, they met in Paris in 2019. It was not working about the Minsk agreements. So we proposed a new way to understand how to build peace. And we identified 4 major discrepancies between Russia and Ukraine. The first one is the historiographic. We have different visions of history if we are in Kiev or if we are in Moscow. The second one is the political gap with regard to the rule of law. We have 2 different understandings of the rule of law and the role of law. The third one is the gap in the vision on what sovereignty means in terms of international relations. And finally, we have different understanding of ecclesiology, how the church should be organized if we are in Kiev or if we are in Moscow. 4 major discrepancies that are connected with the same problem of political theology that I will now describe. I decided to present only 2 of them, the problem of historiography and the problem of ecclesiology, that are consequences of this understanding of ecumenical metaphysics or not. So let's start with this new ecumenical political theology that produces a new historiography, a new vision of the past. As President Zelensky said on May 9, 2022, on the Khreshchatyk in Kyiv, Russia's war on the democratic world is a conflict between two visions of the world. On the one hand, there are those who consider that the nation should blend into a larger whole in which unity is ensured by the emperor, the unique intermediary between God and man, and by the Tsarist motto, orthodoxy, autocracy, and popular feeling. On the other hand, there are those who believe that a nation can only be accomplished by opening itself to the power of the Spirit and by finding, as a result, a fair distance and a just cooperation between temporal power and spiritual authority. We, French people, happen to know this debate very well. Indeed, French and Germans fought hard in 1870 because both claimed to be the only legitimate heir of the Carolingian Empire of Charlemagne. Everyone knows that after the defeat of Napoleon III at Sedan, the proclamation of the German Empire took place at Versailles on January 18, 1871. The fall of the Second Empire in France on September 4, 1870, and the reunification of Germany the following year were the consequences of the humiliation caused by the victory of the Napoleonic armies in Jena in 1806. This conflict was of theological political nature, since to actualize the Holy Empire was to make the head of the state the representative of God, the contemporary of Christ. And this was catched by Adolf Hitler later. After the defeat of the First World War, Adolf Hitler never ceased between 33 and 45 to proclaim the Third Reich, that is to say, the third historical incarnation of the Holy Roman Empire. So you see this difference. On the one side, Germany, who was insisting on the vision of the imperialism of the empire, the Holy Empire, the Third Reich, and on the other side, the French vision of the Republicans insisting on the nation. And I will give you the definition of a nation of Ernest Renan. Ernest Renan is the famous French intellectual. He gave a conference at the Sorbonne University in 1882, and he gave the answer, what is a nation? I quote, "Man is not a slave to his race, nor to his language, nor to his religion, nor to the course of rivers, nor to the direction of mountain. A great aggregation of men, sane in mind and warm in heart, creates a moral conscience which is called a nation." A moral conscience which is called a nation. So you have on one side the idea of the empire that I described with the emperor as the only representative of God on the earth, and you have on the other side the idea of the nation, which is defined by a new political theology that is based on a moral conscience. Renan, indeed, was proposing a new ecumenical political theology of the nation, one that was based on the three principles that had been restored by the Third Republic: liberty, equality, fraternity. This is the moral conscience. Thanks to it, it became possible to think that German-speaking and Protestant regions, such as Alsace-Lorraine, could become part of the French nation if they freely choose the Respublika rather than the empire, to recognize the sovereign freedom of people, to justify the political body of the nation as it appears in the Apocalypse, was of course to pose a theological political truth different of the idea of the empire. Even if in history comparison is not reason, analogies are nevertheless possible. The same tragic fate befalls Crimea and Donbass as Alsace-Lorraine. In the same way that against Renan, a statue of Charlemagne was erected in 1882 in front of the Notre Dame Cathedral, Vladimir Putin inaugurated a statue of Saint Vladimir or Saint Volodymyr, the Prince of Kiev, in front of the Kremlin in 2014. In both cases, we find the same type of mythological, historiographical awareness which consists in making people believe that the state in place is the unique and exclusive legitimate heir of the Holy Roman Empire. For the French and German, it was Charlemagne. For the Russian and Ukrainians, it is Vladimir. Although Vladimir was never in Moscow, because in the 10th century, Moscow was not existing. So you see, it's a mythological reconstruction. And the capital of Charlemagne was Aix-la-Chapelle and not Paris. So the Ukrainians refused this imperial vision inherited from Byzantium and chose the model proposed by the Council of Florence. You know the Council of Unity of Florence in 1439. That was signed by the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, but refused by the Orthodox Church of Russia. This is a second big difference between Russians and Ukrainians that participated in the nation building of two different states. In Ukraine, we have an ecumenical conception of the church, which is based on the Council of Florence. In Russia, we have a political Tsarist understanding of the church, which is based on the refusal of the Council of Florence. The priority in the 16th century in Moscow was to fight against the Tatars, who were Muslims at that time. The priority of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was unity with the Polish king, with Europe. That is a main difference. Conversely, on the Russian side, the state had to embody the power of the Almighty God in order to promote the emergence of nations. The mission of the Russian state was to restore the Holy Empire and the Third Rome, because after the fall of Byzantium in 1453, Moscow was becoming the Third Rome, and there will be not a fourth one. So it had this eschatological vision of the church, which was totally imperialistic. In 2019, our commission, Truth, Justice and Reconciliation, with intellectuals from Russia, from Ukraine, from Western Europe, we met, and we agreed on a first proposal in order to make peace. For us, Russian and Ukrainian historians should follow the example of French and German historians. You know maybe that the French and German historian agreed on a joint historical textbook that was published 20 years ago, but that was started already in the 30s. French and German historians agreed to write the history together against all kinds of mythology. We have in France, for instance, a famous historian. His name is Georges Duby. He wrote a book, Le Dimanche de Bouvines, about the Battle of 1214. We thought that French king at that time won this Battle of Bouvines, and he explained that it was completely a mythology. So Russian and Ukrainians should do the same and write a joint history textbook based on the method of crossed views, les regards croisés. What Paul Ricoeur proposed is that history, it's not memory. History should put together memories through crossed views and find consensus. This is necessary to get out of mythological stories in order to be able to recognize the reality of the Ukrainian national consciousness distinct from the Russian. This is the main priority. This is two national identities that build themselves progressively in a different manner. And we met some Russian historians who were ready to do that work and who agreed with us. Because of his pathological mythology centered on false historiography, Putin vowed to avenge the unbolting of Lenin statues that happened in Ukraine in 2014 after the Revolution of Dignity. In his February 24, 2022 invasion speech, he even claimed that if the Ukrainians no longer want Lenin, then, I quote, they will have to draw all the consequences, which meant for Putin, they will have to come back to the empire when Ukraine was part of Russia. President Medvedev even went so far as to affirm that all forms of Ukrainianness had to be eradicated. This is why the Ukrainian Rada said this is a genocide. So we can understand why the Ukrainian parliament voted a resolution condemning the genocidal project of the Russian state against the Ukrainian nation. There is a real perversity in the speeches of the Russian authorities on the Nazi character of the Russian political leaders, because everyone knows that President Zelensky is himself of Jewish tradition and that the Ukrainian did not elect a single nationalist deputy in the last legislative elections to the Rada. In reality, the truth is much darker. The Russians apply the mirror technique, well known from Soviet propaganda manuals. They accuse the Ukrainians of crimes they carry out themselves in order to present themselves as victims in a position of self-defense. This is a classic technique of Soviet propaganda. So that's the first reason of discrepancy between Russia and Ukraine, the false historiography, and how we can heal it through these textbooks of crossed views. There is another cause of the war between Russia and Ukraine connected with these two metaphysics. On one side, the ecumenical metaphysics, on the other side, the refusal of any metaphysics and the imperial post-Soviet vision. The theological shift is also a consequence of this new ecumenical metaphysics. And I would especially insist on the ecclesiological shift. Since our thesis is that this Russian-Ukrainian conflict is in reality a theological political conflict, which concerns the whole of the so-called Western democratic world against the neo-imperial and revisionist powers, it is appropriate to pay special attention to the ecclesiological dimension of the war, especially since it is probably the main weak point of the Western world to have stored on old shelves all the theological discussions which are interested in the nature, the missions, and the borders of the Church. Now, it is by getting rid of theology that one can fight against heresies. It is on the contrary by making the best theology that we can fight against heresies, and not by forgetting about theology. Patriarch Kirill Gundyaev, the head of the Moscow Patriarchate, does not hesitate himself to affirm that the war that Russia is waging against the collective West is a metaphysical war. He said that on March 14th. On the one hand, there is for him the world of gay pride, which he describes as a decadent world. On the other hand, there is the Holy Russia, which by its rehabilitation of the Russian world is able to build a sacred space within which the kingdom of God on earth can be accomplished. This is a Manichaean vision. This is not Christian, but this is what he believes. And, you know, the Russian nation is 144 million people. Among them, we consider that, well, the Orthodox Church says there are more than 100 million Orthodox believers in Russia. So we have to hear this mythology and this heresy. According to his vision, after the fall of Byzantium, only the Russian Church is able to prepare the coming of the kingdom of God on earth. This imperial conception of Russian identity goes beyond the single figure of Kirill. It is him, however, who is the main ideologue of this Russian world. The theory according to which Ukraine, Belarus, but also Moldova do not have political independence insofar as they belong to the same ethnic group, mythified, and therefore to the same civilizational space. This is the definition of Ruski Mir, the Russian world, which is the main reason invoked by Putin in his invasion speech in February. Denazification, demilitarization goes after this main reason. And this was today, again, you know that today Putin spoke to the old generals of the Russian army, and who was sitting at the first place? Patriarch Kirill. So there is a complete connection between them, because it's a false ideology that on one side the state is in charge of the bodies and the church is in charge of the souls. This is the definition of cooperation, of the symphonia, the symphony between the Russian and state since the Byzantine Empire. And it's a heresy again. because in the Christian vision of incarnation, body, soul, and spirit goes together and are not separated. According to Kirill, this sacred space is dictated by belonging to the Orthodox faith, by the spread of the Russian language, and by a common culture marked by centuries. On the first Sunday of Great Lent, on March 13, Kirill Gundyaev once again justified the invasion of Ukraine in the name of this heretical ecclesiology, which understands the Church only as the Ark of Salvation. I quote, "May the Lord preserve our Church, strengthen our people, and help us all, Russian Orthodox people." I repeat, when I say Russians, I mean the words, "Where does the Russian land come from?" From the Chronicle of Past Times. So, this is a confusion between Russians, Rus, and contemporary Russia. This imperial conception of the Church has been heretical since Bishop Eusebius of Caesarea made the Emperor Constantine the unique mediator of God the Father on earth. You know, that's come from the 4th century. But in the 16th century, Metropolitan Philip II of Moscow reminded to the Tsar Ivan the Terrible, Ivan Grozny, who also believed himself to be the unique representative of God on earth, Metropolitan Philip reminded him of this gospel truth that no one could put itself above the truth of Jesus Christ. He was killed, and since that time, since this tragic event in the 16th century, the Russian Church lost any independence towards the state. But in the Russian emigration, after the Russian Revolution in 1917, some new Orthodox theologians came to Paris. This is what we call the Paris School of Theology. They have an institute, Rue de Crimée, the St. Sergius Institute. Among them, very well-known theologian Sergius Bulgakov. And he renewed completely the ecclesiology. The past one, the one of Kirill, coming from the 16th century, is the imperialist one. The new one considers the Church as a divine human reality. The Church is first of all the bride of the Lamb, l'épouse de l'agneau, niewiesta Agńca. So it's a mystical theology, you see? And that is changing everything. The Church must both be independent of the state and at the same time be able to cooperate with it in the name of the common good. It must be baptismal. It's an ecclesiology which should be baptismal. That means open to all the baptized people regardless of their origins. There is no ethnophilitism here. We are not defining if you are Orthodox because you are Russian. It is baptismal. It is also an ecclesiology which is Eucharistic, centered on the symbol of faith and not on the faith of the prince. This ecclesiology is also nuptial, aware that all of human history has meaning only in the covenant pact with God, and which finishes in the Apocalypse, in the book of Revelation, with the wedding of the Jerusalem, earthly Jerusalem, and the Jerusalem on the high. And this ecclesiology is also pastoral, that is to say, able of preserving the existing links between national and cultural communities and their priests. So you see, it's a total different vision. The idea that the patriarch and the emperor should collaborate together on the grounds that the former was in the charge of bodies while the latter of the souls was completely contradicted by this new wave of theologians, because they were reminding that all authority on earth as in heaven was given to Jesus Christ and not to the emperor. The ascension of Christ does not mean his erasure, but a new form of very real presence and action of God on earth, but accessible only to the eyes of faith. The old theory of Byzantine symphony was shattered as soon as the February Revolution of 1917 happened and removed the situation of dependence of the Church with regard to the power of the Tsar. In other words, this new ecclesiology was fundamentally ecumenical and faithful to the plural tradition of the apostolic churches. It is by virtue of this new ecclesiology that the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople decided to act in 2018-2019 to grant autocephaly to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. This church, indeed, the most important in Ukraine, 15 million believers in a population of 25 million Orthodox in Ukraine, had been asking its autocephaly since decades. Bartholomew was also aware that the non-recognition of this church weakened the Ukrainian nation in the face of the Russian state, which had annexed Crimea in 2014. The Patriarch refused the strictly political argument according to which the Ukrainian church would be part of the canonical territory of the Moscow Patriarchate, which was wrong, as we all know, that it was Byzantine missionaries who came to Ukraine and not from Russia in the 10th century. So today, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which had remained faithful to the Patriarchate of Moscow, has itself decided to cast off the moorings and to emancipate itself from any legal dependence on the Russian Church. No one can predict today how long it will take for the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and the Greek Catholic Church of Ukraine to find the path of dialogue and convergence toward their common heritage. But what we can consider that the ecumenical ecclesiology, baptismal, eucharistic, pastoral, and nuptial, rethought by the theologian of the School of Paris, has a better chance of being implemented in Ukraine than in Russia. And this ecclesiology is completely the consequence of the ecumenical metaphysics of the Pope John Paul II. And this is why it is important to foster this new ecclesiology in Ukraine, where churches are ready to do this. As it was said, I was the founder, the co-founder of the Institute of Ecumenical Studies in Lviv, in Ukraine. So I know that there are churches in Ukraine that are ready to go in this way. But we need, first of all, to recognize these churches, especially from the Roman Catholic Church. It is important to look at this new Orthodox Church of Ukraine in order to foster this ecumenical ecclesiology. This would represent a real source of renewal for the entire Church, including for the Patriarchate of Constantinople, which is also strongly marked by the Byzantine heritage. Because this model of divine humanity is based on the representation of the Church as the bride of the Lamb, according to the vision of the evangelist John, it allows us to get out of a sacralized and clerical vision of the Church without falling into an agnostic or deistic conception of the secular age. This model makes it possible to hold together the Church as the temple of the Holy Spirit, the ark of salvation, the body of Jesus Christ, and the house of the Father. So my conclusion. I began my lecture by recalling the main thesis of the encyclical Centesimus annus. They consist, as we have seen, in the defense of an ecumenical metaphysics, characterized by its eschatological dimension of the kingdom of God accessible in this world, its personalist and dialogical orientation, and finally its defense of the democratic rule of law and the social market economy. I then showed that Ukraine, which welcomed Pope John Paul II in 2001, collectively believed in the prospect of this personalist third way, while Russia, despite having adopted a social doctrine in 2000, continued to believe that this world had only fallen. There is no possibility to participate in the kingdom of God already now in the social doctrine of the Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. This church considered that there was nothing to expect from the state. The state also is fallen. And that the omnipotence of God was disconnected from any free and virtuous action of humanity. My conclusion is simple. The time has come to work together on an authentically ecumenical social doctrine which integrates on one side the best of the Catholic social doctrine, certainly the work accomplished by the Holy See from Rerum Novarum to Centesimus Annus and today Fratelli Tutti or Laudato Si, but also the best of the Protestant tradition, especially the work that has been done by the WCC and the Commission Foi et Constitution, Faith and Order, especially the work on the discernment on ethical issues, because you have seen that one of the main problems is this question of homosexuality, ethical question of gender. The WCC has done a very interesting work, ecumenical work on the way of discernments, on these difficult issues of homosexuality. We should use this experience coming from WCC. But we should use also the work that has been done by the Paris School of Theology on Ecclesiology, Bulgakov, Berdyaev, Afanasiev, Zizioulas, who came from this theological school. This new personalist, sociological metaphysics. For my part, I began such a work in my essay on ecumenical metaphysics. And at the Collège des Bernardins, we tried to work on the possibility of a new political theology that would be also an ethical theology. We need to reconnect ethics and politics. This is what young generations should do. And this is why we are doing this seminar with students in Paris. And we will work also on Ukraine, how we can convince our colleagues in France how to support Ukraine effectively by this basis of ecumenical metaphysics of the social doctrine of the Church that was defined by John Paul II in a prophetic way. Thank you very much for your attention. Merci beaucoup.
Professor Arjakovsky, thank you very much for your excellent lecture. And now we have time for questions. So please use the microphone.
Thank you very much, Professor. Very, very interesting lecture. I'm happy to be able to say that we, as part of the Ut Unum Sint program that we have here with the Institute of Ecumenical Studies, we do have a day on ecumenical social teaching. So that's also part of our work. So it'll be interesting to talk to you more about that.
This is my favorite encyclical, Ut Unum Sint.
Yeah. So I'm interested how you would see the relation between this and what I think Pope Francis is often trying to get at, which is an interreligious approach. I mean, I think you'll probably say these are complementary, probably, but I'd just like you to say a bit more about it. I think it's to me, it also connects with this idea that we haven't talked about at all so far, and I'd be interested to hear what you think about it, which is the idea of natural law. You know, there's a sort of re-emergence in one of the disciplines that I work a lot in, which is business ethics, of the idea of natural law as a basis for a global ethic. And I think this is an interesting development and connects with what you were talking about, this metaphysical renewal that we need. And you were talking about especially in relation to ecumenism, but I think we could say along the side of this, we also need it in relation to an interreligious approach. I would say in some countries, this would be especially helpful. And I think the Christians will be the heart of it, because it will be the Christians who will carry this forward. So anyway, I'm just interested in some of your thoughts about these ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's big questions. We could speak about that for during a long time. What I could say in few words about the first part of your questions, the connection with ecumenical approach and interreligious approach. I think time has come to think it together. Because, first of all, from the start, when here in Rome was created the Pontifical Secretariat for Unity, it was clear that they should think together the question of unity with Protestants and Orthodox, but also with Jews. And this is why in the Secretary, on the same level, there is these two questions connected. So it was natural, the extension of the dialogue, because of this consciousness of this Vatican II documents, that ecumenical dialogue should integrate also interreligious dialogue with Muslims, with Buddhists, and even with agnostics and so on. This is the idea that faith is larger than what we can say about it. And faith is grounded on a new definition of orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is le gouvernail. How do you say gouvernail? The steering wheel. Orthodoxy is the steering wheel of faith and reason. So this is why it is important to define orthodoxy. If we define, as in the past, orthodoxy only in a confessional way, then it doesn't work, because all the churches define themselves as orthodox. So we need to redefine orthodoxy in a new way, and what I proposed is to say that orthodoxy is altogether the right glorification, the right memory, the right truth, and the fair justice. This is four definitions of orthodoxy. And the problem is often we have only one definition of orthodoxy. Today, nowadays, we understand orthodoxy, all of us, as faithful memory. We are Catholic because we are, first of all, faithful to the Pope. The Orientals say we are Orthodox because we are, first of all, faithful to the councils. Whereas the Protestants are saying we are Protestants because we are, first of all, faithful to the scriptures. This is only one definition of orthodoxy, but there are others, the fourth. And so if you have this new understanding of right glorification, faithful memory, right truth, fair justice, then you see that orthodoxy is a tension which allows to discern the sign of God in the history and through the reason. If you have this understanding of orthodoxy, which is not confessional, then you have the possibility to discern the truth also in Judaism, in Islam, in Buddhism, and so on. This is the major change that we should understand in order to go in this new metaphysics, which allows to put together again faith and reason. And here again, the John Paul's encyclical Fides et Ratio, rehabilitating the wisdom of God, allows us to go in this metaphysics. That's for the first part of your question. And the other part is the question of the natural law. This is a question which is not easy, and I know that the Catholic Church asked to the International Theological Commission to work many years on this. And I read the conclusions of this work that was many years prepared. And my conclusion is that we don't understand the same thing when we use this term of natural law if we are in Eastern Europe or Western Europe, in the South, in the North. We have a necessity of epistemological work. If we understand natural law as something static, if we understand natural law as something disconnected from God, it is not the same if we understand natural law as the life of God, as dynamic, as finally the wisdom of God. So if for myself I am closer to this understanding, more connecting the natural law with the life of God, then it allows new discernments. Because God is living and he adapts his truth and his justice with the historical level of consciousness and freedom of humanity and local space-time. So we cannot consider that this is natural law, you see. This is my vision. And I think in an ecumenical way, there is a possibility to work on this. I'm glad I see we agree. Merci.
Thank you. Thank you for presentation, Professor. I just wonder from Ukrainian perspective, because I'm Ukrainian, from diaspora, but I actually lived and worked as a journalist in Ukraine and studied in your Institute of Ecumenical Studies. And so the situation now is really that Ukrainian society, thank you for this presentation about John Paul II, because Ukrainian society, as I discovered, missing this Pope, because with all respect, unlike Pope Francis, John Paul II really understood the mentality of Ukrainians and really understood the mentality of imperialistic mentality of Russia. And I wonder, because from my point of view, in Ukraine there is no problem with ecumenical dialogue or interreligious dialogue. But it's the time now to create this ecumenical doctrine when actually there is a lot of hate in society, and crimes of Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine are unspeakable. As an instrument of propaganda, it works really terrible. And speaking from Ukrainian young society that wants to do nothing religiously, culturally with Russia, so is it not better, according to your opinion, or maybe to opinion of Western world, to wait some time until Ukrainians can rediscover identity? Because yes, it's a multicultural society, but the issue of this war, it's actually that it's a cultural war, and our identity only rediscovering now, because we still totally don't know who we are, and it's a time of changes. And also, speaking about Russian society, I'm like when speaking with Italians here or other Western Europeans, it's always demonizing of two people, or Kirill, Patriarch Kirill, or Putin, but nobody speaks about collective unconsciousness of Russian society, because Ukrainian youth with whom I speak, people, young people, they believe that if one tyrant will be gone, in 5-10 years, Russian society will give birth to a new tyrant. So it's actually, how can we create this ecumenical doctrine in these conditions when orthodoxy, Russian orthodoxy, is an instrument of propaganda that basically is cause of death of many Ukrainians? And as well, I feel, and many people with whom I spoke, it's not to criticize or be disrespectful to Vatican, but it's really truthful that we feel as Ukrainians that this ecumenical dialogue with Russian Orthodox Church is forced on us. We saw it during the Easter when Pope asked Ukrainian and Russian women to carry a cross. We saw it when Pope called Dugin, a propagandist of Russian Mir, Ruski Mir, as a victim of war. We saw it when Pope spoke about Dostoevsky and his humanism, which is totally strange for me, because sometimes as a journalist I wonder, with all my respect to Pope, but I wonder who writes this kind of text and how a little bit irresponsible the choice of language is there to the feelings of Ukrainians. So how can we, in this time, with all respect, not create this hate speech, but how much time do you think will be needed to really create this ecumenical doctrine, but in free way, so Ukrainians will feel, Ukrainian society will feel that this is not forced on them? Because now, honestly, with all respect to Catholic Church and to Western society, all my friends, journalists, all young people whom I know, we feel it's forced on us. There are a lot of discussions, and I think it's really important to create this ecumenical doctrine. But in which way can it be done? So it will be done like including the desire of modern Ukrainian society, not this stereotypical Ukraine that exists in the idea of Western society, of Italian society, which I see in newspapers. Not this idea of Ukraine that immigrants who live abroad for 20 years, but really modern Ukraine that changed totally after 2014. So I would wonder, how do you think it can be done?
Thank you. Thank you. It's good reaction, good question. I agree with you. What is important to understand, first of all, is that ecumenical dialogue does not mean we are all friends, we agree on everything, let's kiss together. That's not what we understand by true dialogue. Ecumenical metaphysics, as I said, from John Paul II until today, needs first of all truth, and then justice, and then only reconciliation, little by little, first of all asking for forgiveness, forgiving, building trust. It's a long step. Ecumenical dialogue doesn't mean let's forget about all this stuff. We are human beings. We are not concerned by the authorities. We are friends. That's not at all the position of ecumenical metaphysics. And this is why it was not easy for us to defend our position when we created our commission with Russians and Ukrainians saying, let's start together. We decided to speak about difficult issues but we were thinking if we intellectuals, diplomats, journalists, experts, religious leaders, we are not starting this process of putting the problem on the table, nobody will do it. So this is our responsibility to take on our shoulder this difficulty to speak with our enemy in order to start the process. That's true also what you say, that the problem is not only Putin or Kirill. And I said that the problem is much more complicated, much more deeper. I insisted on them, but I said they are not the only responsible. The problem is connected with, as you said, a national consciousness. And this is why it is important to work on the foundations of this consciousness. And the foundation of consciousness are connected with history, wrong mythologies. It's connected with ecclesiologies, wrong ecclesiologies. It is connected with understanding of the international relations on fundamental issues. What is the strongest thing in the world? Is it the law, or is it the force, the army? You know, we need to start with these fundamentals in order to agree how to show, to explain, to demonstrate that, in fact, the 20th history, the history of the 20th century has shown that law is stronger than military force. You know, this is not at all what Putin and lots of Russians believe. And the third thing, what you said, you feel that sometimes in the Catholic Church, especially with the positions of the Pope, the Ukrainians were not in agreement with these positions, especially what's happening in Easter. It's a scandal. But you should, first of all, understand that there is an evolution in the position of the Pope. At the start, he thought it would be possible to resonate Putin, to have a dialogue with him. Then he said, no, it's not possible, I will speak with Kirill. And then he said, no, it's not possible because Kirill is a servant of Putin. And then he started to cry. And then he said, there is a problem. Russia is the aggressor and the Ukraine is the victim. So there is an evolution which is possible because people reacted and explained the position of the Ukrainian identity. The responsibility of Ukrainians is that they didn't defend enough themselves, their own identity. Who knows in Italy Grigoris Skovoroda? Who knows? He is the most important philosopher in the Ukrainian history. But in France, nothing was translated from Skovoroda. Can you imagine? For us, that would not be possible to think that Voltaire was not translated in Italy or in Russia or in Ukraine. He is your most important treasure and he was not translated. So this is your responsibility also to show your deep identity. That was not done enough and this is time to do it. Cher ami.
Thank you very much for your lecture, Professor. We had some questions about Ukraine, Vatican, and Catholic Church, but I would like to ask another question about France and about President Macron, because that's the thing which consider many people in Europe also. Because of course we can speak about Pope Francis, who has some problems with understanding what is happening, but from the other hand, we have President Macron, who is trying to constantly talk with Vladimir Putin. That's the first thing. can you explain why is he trying to do that? And the other question would be the question about the history of our part of Europe, because I'm Polish, I'm a student in here, it's a great honor to be able to ask you those questions, but I'm also been visiting France many times, and each time when I'm in Paris and I'm visiting FNAC, and there is very little, zero, I would say, books about our part of Europe. Not only about Ukraine, Poland, but mostly about Central Eastern Europe, but a lot of books about Russia, about the great Russian culture, of course. So the first question would be, can you explain why President Macron is acting like that, trying to constantly talk to Vladimir Putin? Is there any chance to gain peace based on those talks? And the other question would be how we, as Central Europeans, can somehow interest the West in our history, in our point of view. Because I believe that in all this conflict, that would be crucial to not have it again anytime soon. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. Very interesting, very important. This is the theme of my research seminar that will start in January to understand why France is not supporting Ukraine as it should be. We are the first army in Europe. We are the first diplomatic service in Europe. And we do not give enough to Ukraine. We give less than Estonia, less than lots of countries in the eastern part of Europe. This is not normal. It is not normal. You ask why. There are lots of reasons. I will give you just one, because we don't have time. We will work the whole year on this. One explanation, I had the opportunity to meet the President Macron in 2017 when I presented him the project of this commission, and he invited 12 specialists of Russia and Ukraine before his first visit in Russia. On the 12 specialists, only 4 were criticizing Putin. The 8 others, from Hélène Carrère d'Ancos, the academician, to professors from the Sorbonne, I will not give names, because today they certainly feel bad. All they were saying, you know, of course, Putin is a bit strange, you know, but human rights, it's not so important. What is important is to feel that there is unity in Russia, that it's a stable state. We need this for doing business, and business is more important. And if not Putin, then it will be Zhirinovsky, which is worse. Russians are not ready for democracy. So let's speak with people that we know. That's the first and only 4 people like me and 3 others, like Françoise Thom, for instance, were criticizing Putin and saying, look at Ukraine, this is your best chance in order to build stability in Europe. He didn't believe us also because in France we have intellectuals who were marked by their communist past. And the Communist Party, it was 25% of the population until the 80s. And now it is the nationalist parties who are in dialogue with Putin, like Marine Le Pen and others. So he is not completely free also to defend a position. I will give another example. Recently, the Germans decided to recognize the Holodomor as a genocide. Scholz said it's a good idea, and the next week, the Bundestag voted that it's a genocide. In France, We do not recognize that it is a genocide. We even do not recognize that it's a crime against humanity. First of all, because we have this communist past, and second, because our historiography became postmodern and we are in amnesia. This is a total amnesia. And when I explain to the people, Holodomor, it's 20,000 people who died every day, each day, during 6 months. People are horrified to discover this and to discover that it is Stalin himself who decided to erase the Ukrainian national identity. So we need today, again, to explain what happened on the basis of the documents and to vote also at the National Assembly a resolution saying this is a Holodomor. But the 90% of the historians in France say we should not admit les lois mémorielles, memorial laws, because we should be free. We should not consider that we need an ethical basis for politics. Politics and ethics are separate things. So this is our postmodern problem. And then you asked also what should be done from Poland. Eastern, yeah. I am myself part of the platform, as it was said, of the European Platform of Memory and Conscience, which is based in Prague, but which is in connection with lots of Polish National Institute of Memory. The one which is in Warsaw, the one which is in Wrocław, and others, but also in Hungary, in Slovakia. And our main goal is a judgment of the crimes of the communist past. That was not done. You see, that was not done. And lots of countries, Poland included, didn't adopt some laws in order to judge the criminals of the past. But you are much more prepared to do it than us, which are completely in amnesia, you see? And the only people who are proposing a memorial of victims of totalitarianism in Brussels are countries of Eastern Europe. But in the West, nobody considers that it is important to have a memorial in front of the European Parliament insisting on the victims of the totalitarianism, because we are not convinced that totalitarianism is a good concept. We criticize Hannah Arendt when she says that the Soviet totalitarianism can be compared with the Nazi totalitarianism. Lots of people in France will tell you that Hannah Arendt was wrong, you see. So we have lots of things to do. You need to help us, you see, to do this work, because unfortunately, the postmodern philosophy in France is dominant.
Professor, can I ask you a question? Thank you very much. It was very interesting.
So that will be last question.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I would like to ask you questions, very short. But before, I would like to say that, of course, I agree with the senora journalist about the hate. No, it's not a time to. Maybe it's not a time to ask talk about that, about the book of the history. This is a great idea, and of course we have common border with Russians, and sooner or later we must. Its war became at the end, and we must find solution how we can communicate. It's good questions. Maybe not the time, but it's. I like this, the book of the history. Maybe it's. Let's say, uscita in italiano come exit in this situation. And about a little about Holodomor. Yes, you are absolutely right. It's amnesia. It's the problem. Is we must have a judgment, a big judgment. All of this, even they dead, the people who do that. The problem is that the books who write about Holodomor around in the world, Americans, English, everybody knows instead of Ukrainian. I wrote the books in memory my grandma about the Holodomor this time. And I tried to publish it in Ukraine, but all of them told me that it's very sad. Let's make it apart. It was before the war, of course. So I put it on Amazon, I publish it myself, okay. But it's paradox, let's say. And okay, but I think that if we can do this judgment against that people, maybe we can avoid this war in now.
Yes.
If you do in past. So it's just my opinion. So my question is, what do you think when it's a terrible war can be over, and what conditions? It's very short. Only your opinion. What do you think about it? Because the situation became more and more completely, how it says in English, difficult. And what do you think? Because this, let's say, is all time it's higher and higher demands about each party now in the conditions. So, what do you think? When and in which conditions it could be over? Thank you.
It's also a big question. Thank you very much that you asked it. First of all, concerning the Holodomor, you have done the good thing to publish your text. It will be useful. A crime that is not condemned is the crime that is justified. And a crime that is justified is the crime which is repeated. And the Holodomor, the death by freezing, which is happening now, is the consequence of the Holodomor, of the crime by starvation. So, concerning your second question, well, I'm not able to answer. What I know is that the military defeat will not end the war. As I explained, it is a conflict of civilization which are much broader than the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It is a conflict which concerns the future of democracy and the future of new states pretending to be imperial. Not only Russia, but also China, but also Turkey, but also lots of others who do not believe in the universality of human rights, who do not believe in our postmodern understanding of democracy, and we can understand that. We need to heal the wounds that are growing these last 20 years with the ultraliberalism, globalization. We need to heal this, and it goes together with the ecological crisis also. We need to heal this, really, I believe this, by working together, walking together. This is why I speak about ecumenical metaphysics. This ecumenical metaphysics, it's not only for theologians or ecclesiologists, it is for all of us. We need to have, first of all, a conviction that truth exists. Unfortunately, those who won the elections today, like Trump, for instance, and others, create their own truth, the alternative truth. So if you don't have a common vision of truth, each state will create its own reality, which is not reality. And there will be war, because there is a conflict with reality. The war is a conflict with reality. So this is why I say, maybe in the next 8 months, Ukraine will be strong enough to put Russian soldiers out of Ukraine. But that will not be enough to convince all the new populist leaders and all the new imperialist leaders to forget about their imperialist visions. And this is why it is urgent to do education, to do ecumenical work, and to foster this vision of the Christian social doctrine of the churches. This is my conviction.
Professor Arjakovsky, once again, thank you very much that you agreed to be with us tonight, to this evening, and thank you for this fruitful discussions. And I would like to thank you, all of you here in Angelicum, and all of you in front of your screens in homes. And I would like to invite you for a discussion seminar with Professor Antoine Arjakovsky, which will be held tomorrow, Thursday, 22nd of December at 10:30 in Aula 14. And also, I would like to ask you for the next JP2 lecture to be given by Professor Helen Alford, the Dean of the Angelicum's Faculty of Social Sciences, will be held on 18th January 2023. And in the end, I would like to wish you Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.
Thank you.